Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching. Get those reports on the table. Now. The tension in the war room was thick enough to cut with a blade. Hollow displays projected tactical reports across the long, curved table, their glowing symbols flashing red with urgency. A dozen figures surrounded the display, a mix of hardened human officers in their crisp fleet uniforms and alien representatives, their varied forms casting shifting shadows against the cold steel walls of the station. Admiral Oscar Narduli stood with his arms crossed, his sharp gaze fixed on the flickering images of devastation. He was a man built for war, broad shoulders, graying hair cropped short, and eyes that had seen too many battlefields. His expression was stoic, but the rigid set of his jaw spoke volumes. Across from him, Zel Varan, an envoy of the Velak Consortium, flexed his 4 elongated fingers in frustration. The Velak were towering amphibious beings, their leathery skin shifting in deep blues and purples depending on the light. Their people had long remained neutral in galactic disputes, but this war was reaching beyond the boundaries of human expansion. It threatened them all. "The pattern is undeniable," Zel Varan rasped, his throat sacs inflating slightly as he spoke. "This is no longer simple piracy. The Norak marauders are waging a campaign to erase human influence from this region. They aren't just stealing, they're dismantling." Beside him, another alien, shorter, hunched, with chitinous plating running along his elongated skull, let out a clicking growl. Sorak, a strategic advisor from the Thalrex Dominion, was less diplomatic than his Velak counterpart. "You humans should have wiped them out at the first sign of trouble. Now, they believe they own this sector." His mandibles twitched in irritation. "And worse, they're right to think you're weak." "Enough!" Admiral Narduli's voice cut through the rising argument like a blade. The room fell silent. He turned toward General Franklin Joss, the commander of ground operations, who had been listening with his usual stone-faced expression. Joss was an older man, thick-built, his military coat adorned with the scars of old campaigns. "What do we know?" Narduli asked, though he already had the answer. He wanted to hear it from his officers. Colonel James Halstead, tactical analyst, stepped forward and expanded the holomap. His hands moved swiftly over the control panel, zooming in on 3 devastated colonies: Carthan's Landing, Callisto Outpost, and Fort Ares. Each one showed the same grim fate: scorched earth, obliterated infrastructure, and empty space where defense satellites once hovered. 3 strikes, same day, same precision, Halstead began. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of restrained fury beneath it. They didn't just raid, they sterilized these colonies. Power grids destroyed, fuel depots burned, civilian evacuation points bombed. This wasn't about wealth or resources. This was about making sure humans had no foothold left in this region. Narduli's jaw tightened. "Casualties?" "Still counting," Halstead said grimly. "But we estimate at least 40,000 unaccounted for, either dead or taken." The room was silent for a heavy moment. Then Sorak let out a sharp, chittering sound, his species equivalent of an exasperated sigh. Halstead's fingers tightened against the edge of the table. The holomap flickered as he brought up a new set of data streams, recent fleet movements, intercepted chatter, and predictive models. A red marker pulsed over Caldera Station, another over Vitoria 3. "We know their next move," he said, his voice level but firm. "They think they're dictating the battlefield, but they're walking straight into ours." "They made a mistake," Narduli said coldly. "They assumed we wouldn't respond." Zel Varan's deep-set eyes flickered with curiosity. "And will you?" Before Narduli could answer, the room's main comm panel flashed a deep crimson. The station's AI, an austere male voice, filled the war room with its mechanical urgency. "Alert! Incoming distress signal. Priority Alpha. Civilian fleet under attack. Location: Eridani drift. Patch it through, Narduli ordered immediately. The hologram shifted, flickering with static before stabilizing. A pale-faced man in a UISA officer's uniform appeared, the emergency lights behind him casting long shadows against the battered walls of his ship's bridge. Smoke curled in the background, and the distant sound of klaxons blared over the transmission. "This is Captain Jeremy Handley of the Star Hauler Providence. We are under attack by multiple marauder vessels. They came out of nowhere. Shields failing, fighters overwhelmed." A violent tremor rocked his ship, sending sparks flying. A voice from behind him shouted something unintelligible, and then the transmission cut to static. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then Narduli turned sharply to Halstead. "Show me the map." Halstead expanded the tactical display, highlighting Eridani Drift, a crucial waypoint for supply fleets, just beyond the human colony network. "They're making their next move," Joss muttered. Narduli wasted no time. He turned to the officers standing by the communication console. "Send the order. Omega Fleet mobilizing immediately. All combat wings to full alert. Ground forces to standby. We're not waiting for them to finish the job." A moment's hesitation, then the officers snapped into action. Across the station, klaxons blared to life. Emergency lights bathed the corridors in red as battle crews sprinted to their stations. Docking clamps disengaged. Fighter squadrons were launched ahead as the Omega Fleet, humanity's finest war machine in this sector, began to break from the station and set course for war. Narduli took a final look at the tactical display, then met the eyes of his alien allies. When he spoke, his voice was like distant thunder. "You asked if humanity would respond." He turned toward the viewport, watching as the fleet began to mobilize. "Watch closely." The Omega Fleet erupted from hyperspace like a hammer striking steel. Warships surged forward in disciplined formation, engines burning bright against the darkness as they closed in on the chaos unfolding over Eridani Drift. The Star Hauler Providence and its civilian escorts were caught in the jaws of destruction, their hulls scarred by plasma fire, shield capacitors barely holding under the relentless barrage. Norak marauders swarmed them, sleek, angular ships, their hulls adorned with jagged predatory markings. The marauders were a scourge of the outer systems, their tactics as brutal as their reputation. They struck fast, stripped colonies bare, and left nothing behind but wreckage and silence. But today, silence would not be their legacy. "All wings, weapons free," Admiral Oscar Narduli ordered, his voice sharp over the comms. "Protect the civilians at all costs. Make them regret stepping into our space." The fleet responded like a well-oiled machine. Destroyers and frigates unleashed hell, railguns sending hypervelocity rounds, screaming into enemy hulls. Explosions bloomed in the vacuum as Norak raiders shattered under the firestorm, their fractured ships spiraling into the abyss. Strike squadrons streaked through the battlefield, intercepting marauder fighters before they could land another hit on the transports. In the chaos, the USS Broadsword, a heavy cruiser, punched through the enemy formation, its pulse cannons vaporizing a marauder assault corvette, trying to line up a kill shot on the Providence. "Squadrons 3 and 5, break right and cut off their retreat," barked Commander Ethan Darrow, his fighter banking hard as he led his pilots into the fray. "Make sure these bastards don't get a chance to run." The marauders fought back viciously, but the element of surprise was gone. What had started as a slaughter quickly became a bloodbath, for them. The Omega Fleet was not just fighting to survive, they were fighting to eradicate. Far from the battlefield, deep within a shadowed asteroid field, a command chamber buzzed with a different kind of energy. A dozen Norak warlords sat around a circular table, their eyes fixed on massive holoscreens, displaying the unfolding carnage over Eridani Drift. The room was dimly lit, thick with the scent of acrid smoke from burning incense, a custom among their kind before battle. At the head of the table, Kyle Varek, the de facto leader of the Norak Marauders, leaned back in his chair, unfazed. His armor was adorned with trophies, shattered dog tags, insignias ripped from defeated enemies. A predator's smirk curled his lips as he watched another human fighter explode into a fireball. "The humans come fast," he mused, voice gravelly. "But they bleed all the same." Across from him, Varric Nos, a veteran of countless raids, wasn't so amused. His reptilian features remained still, his dark, slitted eyes locked on the screen as a marauder dreadnought was caught in a crossfire between two Omega Fleet cruisers. The ship crumpled under the assault, its remains scattering like ash in a storm. "They don't fight like the others," Nos said, voice low. "Not like the weak bloods who flee when their homes burn." Varric chuckled. "Is that admiration I hear, old friend?" Nos exhaled slowly. "I've fought them before. They are territorial. They don't just defend, they hunt. They pursue. And they do not stop." The warlords around the table exchanged glances. Some scoffed. "So what are you saying?" sneered Joran Threx, a towering brute of a Norak, his plated arms folded across his chest. "That we should run? Beg like the traitors we got." A low rumble echoed from Nos's throat, not quite a growl, but close. "No. I am saying that if we choose this fight, we must understand what we are fighting." Threx waved a dismissive claw. "Bah! They are soft. Look at them, protecting their weak, throwing themselves into battle for civilians who cannot fight for themselves." He let out a dry laugh. "They are predictable." Nos shook his head. "No, that is why they are dangerous. Because to them, it is not just war. It is home." Varric exhaled, watching as a marauder battleship was torn apart on screen. He tapped his claws against the armrest of his chair, thoughtful. "Then we make them choose," he said finally. The warlords turned to him. Varric leaned forward, his smirk widening. "We attack in two places. A station near the colonies, a show of force. The humans will have to react, send defenses, divert resources, and while they scramble to protect it, we burn their next colony to the ground." Silence hung for a moment. Then the warlords chuckled, nodding in approval. Threx grinned. "Force them to pick between their warriors and their civilians. They'll break." "Exactly," Varric said. He turned to Nos. "Still think they're unstoppable?" Nos remained quiet for a moment, watching another Norak ship explode under human fire. His fingers drummed against the table, but his expression remained unreadable. Varric met his gaze, searching for hesitation. He found none. "They won't break," Nos murmured finally. His eyes flicked back to the burning wreckage on the holoscreen. "But if you want this war, at least know what you're walking into." Varric let the silence linger for a heartbeat before leaning forward, his smirk widening. "Then let's see just how far humanity is willing to go." A few cycles later, the Norak marauders made their move. Two separate war fleets broke formation from their hidden stronghold, deep within the asteroid belt of Tarvos Rift, engines burning bright as they surged toward their targets. One force, bristling with attack frigates and assault corvettes, veered toward the human outpost of Caldera Station, a crucial hub in the contested sector. The second fleet, larger and more heavily armed, pushed toward their true prize, the vulnerable colony on Vitoria 3. Standing on the bridge of his command ship, Varric Nos watched the holographic display of their advance. His slit pupils flicked between the two diverging forces, his mind calculating possibilities faster than he liked. The attack was moving forward exactly as planned, but something in his gut twisted. He should have felt exhilaration. Instead, he felt doubt. His clawed fingers tightened against the railing as his ship aligned with the second fleet, the one bound for Vitoria 3. His bioluminescence flickered briefly as he forced himself to focus. Kyle Varric's strategy was sound. Strike both locations. Force the humans to split their forces. Make them choose. And yet, his eyes lingered on the data feeds from Eridani Drift, wreckage from their last engagement still drifting in the void. They had underestimated the humans before. Would they do so again? Nos shook the thought away. He was Norak. He was warborn. There was no room for uncertainty. He turned to his second-in-command, Gorik, a brute of a warrior with a scarred crest and deep-set predatory eyes. "We make the humans pay for what they did at Eridani," Nos growled, his tone low and menacing. Gorik bared his fangs in a grin. "They will beg before the end." The command deck rumbled as the fleet initiated its final jump. Over Caldera Station, the Norak marauders descended like a storm of fire and steel. Their ships tore through the void, emerging from hyperspace in a brutal spearhead, engines howling as they surged forward. Plasma cannons spat death before their hulls had even fully materialized, their assault instantaneous, merciless. The first barrage landed hard. Blue-white explosions rippled across the station's outer plating, tearing through external comm arrays, peeling away thick slabs of reinforced armor like dead flesh. Missiles streaked forward, leaving glowing trails in their wake before smashing into the station's defensive grid. The concussive force rippled outward, shockwaves distorting the void for miles. No response, no hails, no pleas. The station did not answer because there was no one left to answer. "Rip it apart!" Commander Threx bellowed from his command throne, his mandibles flaring as he gripped the armrests. The scent of burning circuitry filled the air, static crackling through the warship's comms from the raw energy of the bombardment. "Full assault! Plasma batteries! Missile salvos! Break their defenses!" The Norak fleet advanced like a tidal wave, warships shifting into a disciplined wedge formation as they pressed the attack, pushing deeper into the station's range. Flanking frigates darted outward, weaving through the carnage as they pummeled the outpost with relentless fire. Missiles shrieked through the vacuum, glowing like miniature stars before slamming into the station's outer layers. More explosions, more destruction. Yet still, no transmissions, no distress calls. Shockwaves rippled through Caldera's structure, fissures forming along exposed conduits. Secondary detonations blossomed in quick succession, fire and wreckage spewing into the abyss. More automated turrets snapped to life, spitting desperate streams of counterfire. But the marauders were prepared. Shields flared against the retaliation, Norak pilots banking hard as flak rounds detonated around them, shredding lesser craft in their wake. Then, the hangars opened, and the defenders poured out. Sleek human fighter craft launched into the chaos, their engines blazing as they wove between missile trails, cannons blazing. Their formation was razor sharp, their response immediate, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. No pilot helmets glinted behind the canopies. There were no hands on the controls. Norak interceptors twisted through the battlefield to meet them head-on. Cannon fire ripped across the black, blue-hot plasma, slashing through hull plating as the two forces collided in a brutal dogfight. A human fighter banked too slowly. A direct plasma blast took its fuselage, spiraling the craft into a ruptured turret before it vanished in a fiery burst. Another Norak raider veered sharply, railgun rounds puncturing its cockpit. The pilot's shriek cut short as the ship tumbled lifelessly into the debris field. The void became a maelstrom of light and wreckage, an exploding tapestry of maneuvers, counter-maneuvers, and bodies torn apart in the cold black. The battle should have been over quickly, yet the station still stood. "Bring down their shields!" Threx snarled, his plated fist slamming against the console as he watched the defenses hold. Counterfire thickened, fighter squadrons deployed with unnatural precision. The colony should have been scrambling for survival, but the resistance was anything but desperate. Every counterstrike was precise, every maneuver calculated. Caldera was built for war, one that needed no crew to fight it. More torpedoes screamed toward the outpost. Another detonation, a shield generator ruptured in a violent explosion, sending a fireball cascading outward, consuming debris and smaller fighters in its wake. Yet the station's guns still roared, still locked on, still tore through the Norak ranks with unrelenting fury. They were winning. The station was breaking apart, the defenses were failing, and soon Caldera Station would belong to the Marauders. On Vittoria 3, the final preparations were being made. In the central command bunker, General Franklin Joss stood before a tactical map, his expression calm, methodical. The colony's defenses had been carefully positioned, layered not for survival, but for entrapment. He turned to Admiral Oscar Narduli, who had arrived just minutes ago. "They're coming," Joss said simply. Narduli nodded, eyes cold as steel. "Then let's make sure they never leave." The Norak marauders tore through the atmosphere of Vitoria 3, their fleet descending in coordinated waves. The lead assault cruisers roared forward, flanked by swarms of raider craft that streaked through the sky like predatory birds. Plasma fire rained down in torrents before their landing craft had even touched the ground. The colony looked vulnerable. A sprawling network of modular buildings, industrial depots, and landing pads spread wide across the rocky terrain. Defenses appeared minimal. A few automated turrets responded weakly, their rounds missing more often than landing. There was no fleet in orbit, no military garrison in sight. It was exactly as they had expected. "Hit the infrastructure first," Commander Gorik snarled over the marauder comms. "No mercy. We cripple them before we take them." A chorus of acknowledgements filled the channel, and the first wave of bombing runs commenced. Missiles screamed toward the ground, slamming into power grids and communication relays. The civilian spaceport erupted into fire. Ships caught mid-takeoff, incinerated in the blast. Storage depots burst apart, sending plumes of fire and debris skyward. Shockwaves rippled through the colony. Fleeing colonists scattered across the streets, their voices lost beneath the roar of engines and the howl of impact tremors. Fireballs blossomed in the distance as Marauder strike teams broke from the main assault group, targeting medical centers, water purification plants, anything essential for survival. The human resistance had yet to show itself. Gorik sneered. "They're running already." Then the defenses woke up. The first barrier shields came online with a pulse, shimmering domes of blue energy snapping to life over key residential zones. Surface turrets, seemingly inactive before, suddenly rotated with machine-like precision. Ground-based anti-aircraft batteries, disguised as innocuous colony structures, burst from the soil and locked onto inbound craft. Before the Marauders could adjust, the colony fired back. Railguns punched through Marauder formations, tearing through armor plating and splitting hulls in half. Autonomous drone fighters launched from underground silos, their sleek forms cutting into the attack force like surgically precise knives. A Norak gunship took a direct hit to its engines, spiraling out of control before plowing into a refinery tower, detonating on impact. Another assault corvette, confident in its bombing run, was shredded mid-air by a plasma turret hidden within a civilian structure. In the command bunker, General Franklin Joss watched the chaos unfold through the tactical displays. His hands rested on the table, calm, steady. "They're still adjusting," he said, eyes narrowing as the Marauders hesitated, momentarily thrown by the colony's preparedness. Admiral Oscar Narduli stood at his side, arms crossed. The distant tremors of anti-aircraft batteries firing barely registered in his mind. "They thought we'd be scrambling," Narduli said. Joss nodded. "They thought wrong." A comms officer turned, tension clear in his voice. "Enemy ground forces landing, multiple drop zones." Joss exhaled. "And now it begins." The Norak infantry hit the ground in coordinated ranks, their drop pods slamming into the colony's outskirts. Plated warriors emerged, weapons raised, sweeping the area with infrared sensors. They moved in disciplined, combat-tested units, expecting a panicked response from the humans. Instead, they found nothing. The streets were empty. Shattered storefronts and burning vehicles lined the roads. The few colonists that hadn't fled were already inside shielded bunkers. Gorik's throat rumbled in irritation as he advanced with his unit. The colony was silent. The only sounds were the crackling fires and the distant echoes of collapsing structures. No shouts, no screams, just emptiness. They're retreating into their holes. He stepped over a corpse, a civilian, burned from the bombing runs. His sneer widened. Cowards. A Norak communications officer spoke through the channel. "No resistance spotted yet. The humans must be regrouping deeper inside." Gorik growled, irritation lacing his tone. "Then flush them out," pushed toward the city center. As the Marauder squads advanced into the deeper sections of the colony, something changed. Shadows moved. A lone figure darted between a collapsed structure and a transport wreck, too fast for any infrared scanner to track. Then came the first kill. A Norak soldier, positioned at an intersection, crumpled suddenly. A single, silenced round punched through his throat. He was dead before he hit the ground. Another warrior turned, just in time to see a plasma grenade arc over a rooftop and land squarely in the middle of his squad. The explosion tore through them. Marauder comms erupted with warnings, but it was already too late. From the shadows, the humans emerged. The colony's defenders were not civilians scrambling for survival. They were waiting. Marine fire teams, outfitted in combat exo-rigs, moved through the streets with lethal precision. Urban warfare specialists, trained for exactly this type of engagement, dictated the battle on their terms. They didn't hold defensive positions. They moved. Flanking maneuvers cut off advancing Norak squads before they realized they were trapped. Heavy gunners ambushed key intersections, forcing the Marauders into open spaces where sniper teams picked them off one by one. And they were not alone. Then the shadows moved in ways the Norak didn't expect. Not just humans. Chitinous figures darted between the wreckage, blades glinting as they tore through Norak warriors like paper. Plasma bolts came not only from rifles, but from sleek reptilian marksmen perched atop colony rooftops. They had come expecting to crush humans. Instead, they had walked into a war led by monsters they had never accounted for. Thalrex shock troopers, their chitinous armor gleaming, carved through marauder formations with brutal efficiency. Their clawed gauntlets shredded through Norak plating like it was paper. Valak rangers, agile and precise, moved across rooftops, sending devastating plasma bolts into high-value targets. The Marauders expected to fight humans. They did not expect to fight all of them. Gorik, pinned behind the wreckage of a fallen gunship, finally understood. This was never about survival, he growled to himself, watching as his forces were isolated, outmaneuvered, and dismantled piece by piece. This was a message. Back in the bunker, Joss watched the battle shift in real time. The Marauders, once so confident, were now fighting for their lives. A transmission from one of his ground officers crackled through. "General, enemy forces are still pushing, but they're falling into the trap. We're cutting them off at every major sector." Joss gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Good. Keep the pressure on. Make them regret ever setting foot here." A pause, then a voice from a spotter positioned on the outer perimeter. "Sir, we have visual on another incoming wave." Joss turned, his face impassive. "Numbers? Large. At least 3 full battalions. They're coming in hard." For the first time, Nardulli smiled. "Let them come." At Caldera Station, the last human defense turret sputtered and fell silent, its barrel melting under the relentless barrage. Norak warships encircled the station like scavengers around a dying beast, their plasma cannons hammering what little remained of the outpost's once formidable defenses. The battle seemed over. Commander Threx stood at the bridge of his ship, his slitted pupils narrowing as he watched the station's outer hull crack and buckle under sustained fire. The massive structure shuddered as internal detonations burst through its framework, exposing skeletal corridors and sending debris spiraling into the void. "All units, concentrate fire," Threx growled. A final salvo erupted from the Marauder fleet, tearing through the station's core. Explosions rippled outward in a chain reaction, the flames consuming docking bays, fuel depots, and what little infrastructure was left. For a brief moment, Caldera Station held together, its battered form clinging to existence through sheer defiance. Then, with a deep, resonating shockwave, it ceased to be. The explosion ripped outward, a wave of energy scattering debris into the darkness. Threx's ship viewports darkened momentarily from the sheer brightness of the blast before recalibrating. The wreckage of Caldera drifted apart, its ruin marking the complete eradication of the human foothold in this part of the sector. A grin stretched across Threx's mandibles as he turned to his comms officer. "Send the message to Varric," he ordered. "Caldera Station is dust. We have this war." The officer nodded and transmitted the report. On Vitoria 3, the Norak commanders gathered in their forward position received the message. Kael Varric, flanked by his war chiefs, read the transmission on his holodisplay, his expression betraying nothing. Around him, the command post buzzed with energy. Dropships landing, tactical squads deploying, the battle in full swing. The humans were retreating into the colony, just as they had expected. "Caldera is destroyed," one of his officers reported, his voice laced with triumph. "Threx is en route to reinforce us." Varric's mandibles clicked as he absorbed the information. He turned to Varric Nos, the only commander who had voiced concern about the humans earlier. "Do you still think they're anything more than prey?" Varric asked. Nos didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the battlefield beyond the viewport, on the colony below, where the humans had not broken. Instead, they were waiting. Varric snarled, "Advance the line. End this." The order was given. The Norak forces surged forward. Drop pods slammed into the colony's outskirts in rapid succession, their reinforced doors blasting outward as squads of armored warriors spilled into the streets. Strike teams fanned out, advancing in aggressive ranks, weapons raised, infrared scanners sweeping for targets. Gunships screeched overhead, strafing key intersections with bursts of plasma fire, reducing abandoned vehicles and structures to slag. Marauder shock troopers smashed through entryways, expecting to clear out the last pockets of resistance. They found nothing. No civilians, no retreating soldiers. Just empty buildings and silent roads, the air thick with smoke and distant echoes of burning wreckage. "Keep pushing," barked a squad leader over comms. "They're deeper inside, herding themselves into a kill zone." The Norak pressed forward, weapons primed, formations tightening as they funneled into the colony's main corridors. Then the battlefield changed. At first it was subtle, a faint distortion in the airwaves, a strange static on their comm channels. Then, complete blackout. Marauder officers barked orders into their headsets, no response. Fleet commanders attempted to coordinate reinforcements, nothing came through. Their HUDs flickered erratically, displaying mismatched telemetry. Their own dropships struggled to communicate with landing teams. The humans had cut them off. In the skies above Vitoria 3, defense grids came online with ruthless coordination. What had seemed like abandoned anti-air batteries erupted to life, locking onto inbound Norak craft. The skies, once controlled by the Marauders, became a maze of precise kill zones. A squadron of Norak gunships, attempting to establish a beachhead, were instantly targeted and obliterated, their fuselages torn apart by railgun fire from concealed batteries. A Marauder corvette, trying to escape the crossfire, was shredded mid-air, its remains scattering across the battlefield like falling embers. Panic rippled through the ground forces. Drop pods landed blindly, their squads unaware of the chaos above. They advanced into the colony, expecting disorganized resistance, expecting scattered survivors. Instead, they walked into a kill box. The streets came alive with death. From every shadow, every alley, every structure, human forces erupted like a controlled detonation. The chaos the Norak thought they had caused was not human desperation. It was the smokescreen of a meticulously planned ambush. The sudden interference in communications had already left the Corsairs disoriented, their formations fragmenting as orders were lost in the void. Some units tried to recalibrate their signals, adjusting frequencies, but no command came, no response arrived. And then the Marines struck. Clad in armored exo-rigs, their rifles loaded with armor-piercing rounds, the Space Marines led the charge. They didn't hold defensive positions. They advanced, carving through the Norak ranks with lethal efficiency. A Norak advance team, pushing toward what they believed was a civilian shelter, found something entirely different. A fortified barricade. Human Marines crouched low behind cover, rifles steady, waiting. The first volley tore through the frontline soldiers before they could react, their bodies thrown back as if crushed by an invisible hammer. The survivors tried to regroup, but before they could stabilize, a second wave of gunfire swept through the corridor. Precise, fatal. Further ahead, a Marauder shock unit, attempting to reorganize its offensive, was met with something far worse. Grenades cut through the air, flashing red in the NORAC's sensors. But when the soldiers tried to run, the explosions ripped them apart. This wasn't war. It was a culling. From every ruin, every corner, Marines moved like predators, flanking their prey, cutting off retreat paths before the NORAC even realized they were trapped. Through the dust-choked air, other figures moved among the humans, not just soldiers of Earth, but alien allies. Thalrek's commandos emerged from the shadows, their claws drenched in NORAC blood, their attacks swift and brutal. One of them landed atop a NORAC attempting to reach cover, splitting him from throat to abdomen in a single motion. On the rooftops, the Valak Rangers demonstrated why their guerrilla tactics were feared across countless worlds. Their rifles hummed in the silence, each shot marking a target, each impact burning through NORAC helmets and skulls alike. The Marauders expected scattered fire, expected desperate resistance. What they found was calculated extermination. They still tried to fight, still tried to retreat, but wherever they turned, the Marines and their alien allies were already there. A NORAC commander, blood seeping between the plates of his armor, pressed his wrist communicator, desperately trying to open a secure line. Nothing. He looked up, searching for reinforcements, expecting to see his forces still holding the line. Instead, he saw his army being dismantled. They were not just fighting humans, they were fighting something far greater. Nos watched from behind cover, his forces collapsing under the sheer efficiency of the human response. He saw his warriors isolated, unable to coordinate, unable to retreat. He saw his reinforcements obliterated before they could land. He saw human units moving in sync with their alien allies, executing tactics that no NORAC formation had ever faced before. He saw a war they could not win. Varric had ordered a slaughter. Instead, they had walked into one. The battle was no longer about taking the colony. It was about surviving it. The NORAC Marauders formations, once tight and disciplined, were now fractured, desperate, chaotic. Isolated squads clung to whatever cover they could find, their comms dead, their commanding officers either slaughtered or missing. And the humans never stopped coming. Plasma bolts cut through the smoke-choked air, the sharp cracks of gunfire rolling like thunder through the broken streets of Vitoria 3. Human Marines and their alien allies moved like wraiths, striking from the ruins and disappearing before the NORAC could regroup. For every NORAC squad that tried to push forward, another was wiped out. For every counterattack, the humans were already in position to crush it. Commander Gorik, pinned behind the smoldering wreck of a drop pod, let out a furious snarl as another transmission failed to connect. "Damn this interference!" His claws dug into the dirt. "We're fighting in the dark." One of his remaining officers pressed a hand against his helmet, frustration clear on his scaled face. "No response from command! No response from anyone!" Gorik hissed. They had underestimated the humans again. They hadn't just jammed their comms, they had cut them off entirely. They were fighting blind, and the humans knew exactly where they were. Above the battlefield, more NORAC fleet arrived. The remnants of Threx's warships, fresh from the destruction of Caldera Station, tore through the void as they dropped out of hyperspace over Vitoria 3. They came in expecting victory. Instead, they found silence. The fleet's commander, Threx, stood at the bridge of his flagship, his mandibles twitching as he surveyed the scene before him. He had left Caldera Station victorious. Now, he would finish the war at Vitoria 3. The colony was still burning. The battle was still raging, but something was wrong. His tactical screens were empty, feeding back only static. No targeting data, no landing beacons, no fleet telemetry, nothing. "What is this?" Fornak growled. "Unknown interference," his sensor officer reported. Our battlefield scans are completely offline. A ripple of unease moved through the command deck. Before Vornak could order a course correction, his ship shuddered violently. The humans had been waiting for them. The planetary defense grid, hidden for so long, lit up like a starburst, its railguns and torpedoes already locked onto the incoming fleet. One of Vornak's frigates exploded instantly, its hull splitting apart as high-velocity rounds ripped through its core. A Norak carrier still maneuvering took a direct hit to its hangar bay, its deck igniting in a blinding chain reaction. "Shields up! Break formation!" Vornak barked, but it was too late. The humans had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. On the ground, Nos watched it all unfold. From his position, half buried in the wreckage of what had once been a Norak command post, he saw the faint streaks of fire in the sky as his fleet was torn apart. He saw his warriors, disorganized, leaderless, terrified, trying to regroup only to be cut down by the relentless human assault. And he understood. The humans had never been defending this colony. They had been baiting them into this perfectly laid trap. They were avenging the others. The battlefield belonged to the humans now. Norak warriors, once feared across the sector, were falling back in every direction. But there was nowhere left to run. Squads that tried to regroup were ambushed before they could establish defensive lines. Gunships that attempted to retreat were blasted from the sky by the colony's anti-air defenses. One of Gorek's last commanders, pinned in a ruined courtyard, snarled over what remained of their communications. "We must hold the line," he roared to the warriors around him. And then a plasma blade pierced his throat. A Thalrex commando pulled the weapon free, watching as the Norak collapsed, his lifeless body crumpling to the dust. The warriors around him froze. For the first time, they saw what they were truly up against. Not just humans, but something greater. Human Marines, flanked by their alien allies, closed in from all sides. There was no escape. Nos stood in the ruins, his breathing ragged, his armor cracked and covered in blood. Norak blood. He could still hear the sounds of his people dying, the last gunfire fading into the distance. This was not the war he had envisioned. The humans had been underestimated again and again, and every time they had proven exactly what they were. And this war was already lost. Their fleet, once a brutal force of conquest, was now a graveyard of shattered hulls and burning wreckage. The skies above Vitoria III were thick with debris and flame, the last remnants of their once mighty armada, now little more than twisted, broken vessels, drifting lifelessly through the void. On the surface, the battle was no longer a battle. It was a hunt. Norak warriors, who had once charged forward with unwavering confidence, were now reduced to scattered survivors, trying to hold ground that no longer belonged to them. Their comms were dead, their officers were dying, and their reinforcements had already been annihilated before they could even land. The humans were relentless. A Norak squad, trapped in the ruins of what had once been a supply depot, fired blindly into the fog of battle, their weapons overheated, their movements frantic. They barely had time to react before a barrage of armor-piercing rounds shredded through their cover, sending 4 of them crumbling to the ground in a spray of dark blood. From the smoke, a unit of human Marines emerged, weapons raised, movements cold and methodical. A Norak officer, his plated armor scorched and dented, raised his rifle in a final act of defiance, before a single shot punched through his skull, silencing him forever. Above Vitoria III, the Norak fleet burned. Flaming wreckage drifted aimlessly through the void, the remnants of what had once been a force of unstoppable conquest. Threx stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching as another of his cruisers erupted in a silent fireball, its hull splitting apart under the relentless barrage of planetary railguns. His fists clenched against the command console, his breath ragged, his mandibles twitching with barely contained fury. This was not supposed to happen. He had led the assault on Caldera Station. He had watched it burn, watched its ruins scatter like dust. He had pushed into Vitoria III with the full force of the Norak war machine. And yet here he was, his fleet crumbling, his warriors slaughtered, his empire unraveling before his eyes. A fresh impact rocked the ship. Alarms blared. Damage reports flooded his displays, overlapping in chaotic bursts. But something else flickered through the system. An anomaly. At first, it was just static. Faint, broken transmissions bleeding through the interference. Then, like a signal clawing its way back from the void, voices began to emerge, scattered, fragmented, but unmistakably Norak. Any command, position lost, repeat, requesting. For hours, the battle had been fought in silence. Now the interference was failing. Not all at once, but in waves, flickering like a dying flame. Perhaps the humans' jamming systems were depleting. Perhaps the battlefield itself, scorched, cratered, drowning in wreckage, had disrupted their signal barriers. Threx didn't notice. He had ripped out his earpiece and thrown it aside when it failed him. His world had already narrowed to one thing. He spun toward his officers, his voice a guttural roar. "Bring us down! Now!" His crew hesitated. It was suicide. "Now!" he snarled. The ship lurched violently as it pierced through the planet's atmosphere, its hull burning on re-entry. Threx barely felt it. His mind was locked onto one thing. He would not die in the void. He would die on the battlefield. He would tear these humans apart with his own claws before they took his last breath. The flagship plummeted, its engines screaming as it nosedived toward the war-torn colony below. Impact alarms wailed. The command deck ruptured apart as the ship slammed into the outskirts of the battlefield, tearing a deep scar into the land. Metal twisted. Flames burst from the wreckage. Bodies littered the ground around the crash site. And from the inferno, Threx emerged. His armor was shattered, molten steel clinging to his plating. His left mandible hung loosely, half torn from the impact. Smoke curled from his war-torn frame, but he did not falter. He was Norak. He would not kneel. The battlefield had become a slaughterhouse. Human marines, Thalrex commandos, and Valak sharpshooters moved in perfect unison, cutting through his remaining forces with merciless precision. His warriors were dying in droves, their screams lost in the chaos. Threx did not retreat. He roared, charging into the fray, blade gauntlet flashing. He carved through the first human soldier in a spray of blood, his massive frame crashing through enemy lines like a wrecking ball. A second Marine fell beneath his claws, his armor torn open like paper. But for every kill, there were always more. Gunfire tore into him. A round punched through his shoulder, another grazed his ribs, sending sparks across his plating. He swung wildly, a beast in his final stand, unyielding even as death closed in. A shadow moved in the smoke. Before he could turn, a railgun round slammed into his gut, piercing his armor clean through. Threx staggered, his breath hitching. He dropped to one knee, his vision flickering. Blood pooled beneath him, steaming against the scorched ground. Through the smoke, a human figure stepped forward. A soldier, his rifle steady, his face obscured behind a visor. There was no hesitation, no words, just cold, absolute execution. A second shot, straight through the chest. Threx gasped, his mandibles twitching, his claws curled weakly, his vision darkening. He tried to take one last step, one last act of defiance, but his legs failed him. And then he fell. The warlord who had led the Norak to countless victories, who had razed human worlds to ash, who had once stood untouchable, was dead. Far from the battlefield, in the Norak command chamber aboard Varek's flagship, the holoscreens flickered. Static filled the channels. The battle reports were coming in fragmented, distorted. The tide had turned. And then, the final transmission. Threx was gone. Silence fell over the chamber. One of his war chiefs let out a low growl, his mandibles clicking in disbelief. "Impossible," another muttered, his voice hollow. Varek's eyes burned with rage, his claws dug into the command console. "Then we have already lost." For the first time, fear crept into the ranks of the Norak leadership. They had thought themselves untouchable. They had thought humans would break. But now, the truth was undeniable. Threx was dead, and humanity was still standing. Elsewhere, other Norak warlords met their end. Commander Horal, pinned inside the wreckage of his downed gunship, roared in defiance as human flamethrowers swept through the cabin, turning the last of his forces into charred husks. War Chief Desrak, bleeding from a gut wound, tried to rally his remaining troops, only to be gunned down mid-sentence, his body trampled underfoot as the battle raged on. The Norak chain of command was disintegrating. Each time a leader fell, the survivors panicked further. Each time a group tried to retreat, they were cut down. The battlefield was a web of destruction, and the Norak were caught in it with no escape. Varric Nos stood at the edge of the battlefield, staring through the shattered viewport of his dropship at the ruins below, at the dying remnants of his people. The fires reflected in his dark eyes, flickering like dying embers. His hands, once steady, now trembled at his sides, not from fear but from understanding. He watched humans and their alien allies moving in perfect unison, cutting through the scattered Norak warriors like predators closing in for the final kill. He watched as Threx, the ruthless, the merciless, the war-hungry, lay dead in the mud, his forces decimated around him. He had thought the humans were just another enemy, but they weren't. They were more than brutal warriors, more than unforgiving tacticians. They were something else entirely, and that's why the Norak had lost. High above the ruins of Vitoria III, within the command chamber of the last functional Norak warship, Varric stood motionless, his claws tightening against the cold steel of the command console. The battle was lost. The fleet was gone. The Norak war machine had been shattered, its warlords dead or fleeing. Yet, even in his silence, rage burned beneath his cold exterior. A frantic voice crackled through the flickering holo display. "Warlord Varric, our forces are in full retreat. Orders?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, his mandibles twitched. "If we die, we take something with us." The bridge fell silent. The remaining officers exchanged hesitant glances, awaiting clarification. A human transport is evacuating their wounded. His voice was ice. "Destroy it. Make them feel our death." A low, rumbling acknowledgement spread through the chamber. It was not a strategy. It was not a counterattack. It was spite. Below, in the burning wreckage of Vitoria III's skies, the Norak remnants obeyed. 3 attack corvettes peeled away from the retreating fleet, their plasma cannons charging as they set a direct course for the transport. Their lead ship, a jagged, blackened raider with deep red war markings, accelerated ahead of the others. On board the transport, alarms screamed. The pilot's voice was raw with urgency. "We've got incoming. Fast movers. 3 ships, full speed." The Marines inside barely had time to react. They had fought on the ground, torn through the Norak like a storm. But here, they were trapped in a metal shell, vulnerable. One of them, still covered in blood and soot from the ground battle, grabbed the comm unit. "This is Alpha Transport. We have wounded on board, requesting immediate fighter cover." The response came quickly, sharp with urgency. "Copy, Alpha Transport. Redirecting squadrons to your position. ETA 2 minutes. The Marines' grip on the comm tightened. 2 minutes. The Norak ships would be on them in seconds. The transport's defensive turrets spun up, tracking the incoming hostiles, but they were outgunned. The Norak were faster, and they were coming. A heartbeat before the first shot was fired. Everything changed. One of the Norak corvettes suddenly veered off course, its thrusters sputtering wildly. Then, without warning, it turned its weapons on its own fleet. A burst of energy fire lanced through space, slamming into the Lade Raider's starboard side. The ship lurched, spiraling into the wreckage below. The other marauders hesitated, confusion crackling over their open channels. What the hell was that? Who fired? Another blast. The second raider took a direct hit to its engines, detonating in a blinding explosion that sent debris scattering in all directions. The final Norak ship twisted violently, its pilot struggling to evade the sudden betrayal. And then the comms opened. A deep, steady voice cut through the static, a voice that had once belonged to the enemy. There was a brief silence, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. For years, he had fought for the Norak. For years, he had followed orders, but now for the first time, he chose his own path. You humans deserve this win. Varric Nos stood on the bridge of his vessel, his claws tightening over the controls. The wreckage drifted lifelessly outside his viewport, the final remnants of a war that should have never been fought. He had warned them. They hadn't listened. Now, he had made his choice. With a guttural click, Nos inputted his final command. Deep within the Norak fleet's network, access codes, his codes, unraveled like a virus. Targeting matrices glitched, weapons went offline, shields faltered. For 30 seconds, the remaining Norak forces were blind. It was enough. The transport surged forward, breaking free of the kill zone. Inside, the tension hung heavy, the aftermath of near-certain death settling in. The Marine with the comm exhaled sharply, gripping his rifle, even though there was nothing left to shoot. Who the hell just saved us? Silence. No one answered. Varric Nos didn't wait for thanks. His ship veered sharply, engines burning white-hot as he fled into the abyss. He had no illusions. He was a dead man among his own kind now. But at least he had chosen how this battle ended. On the surface of Vittoria III, standing atop the ruins of a shattered Norak dropship, Admiral Oscar Narduli and General Franklin Joss watched the last enemy ships disappear into hyperspace. The war was over. The bodies of the fallen littered the battlefield, both human and alien alike. The flames still smoldered in the wreckage, the air thick with the acrid stench of spent ammunition and burnt flesh. The Norak had come expecting to wipe them out. Instead, they had been the ones erased, and now it was time to make sure everyone knew it. Nearby, Captain Halstead and his team were already sifting through the ruins of a fallen Marauder cruiser. The remains of the ship's comm system flickered weakly, still linked to long-range Norak frequencies. "This one still has power," Halstead called over the radio. "We can use it." Narduli stepped forward, his boots crunching against shattered Norak armor. Joss stood beside him, arms crossed, scanning the battlefield with an unreadable expression. For a moment he said nothing. Then his voice was low, firm. "Make it count." Narduli gave a single nod. "Open a channel." Halstead asked, "Sir, you want to send a message on their frequency?" The Admiral's expression didn't change. "I want to send a message on every frequency." A few keystrokes later, the signal went live. Across the sector, from the debris fields of Caldera Station to the farthest reaches of Norak-controlled space, every remaining comm receiver crackled to life. Ships still limping away from battle heard it. Civilian outposts in contested territories heard it. Even those who had only watched from the sidelines heard it. Admiral Narduli's voice came through, cold and commanding. "You thought we would run. You thought we would break." A pause, the sound of burning wreckage crackling beneath his boots. "But let this be a lesson to all. Humanity does not yield. We do not forget, and we do not stand alone." He turned, gazing over the battlefield, at the Marines who had fought and bled for this ground, at the Thalrex commandos, still standing beside their human brothers, at the Velak sharpshooters, weapons still raised. This war hadn't been fought alone. "Never attack humans or our allies again. Ever." The transmission ended. Hey there, space human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. Or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Oh, and one last thing. Every great soldier knows that to survive and become a hero, taking care of yourself is key. So before you go, check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's important. And I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.